Hello everyone! Today we continue our journey into the roots of Messianic Judaism. If you're new to our channel, we highly recommend subscribing to join us in studying the teachings of Jesus Christ. For those who've been following my work, please give this video a thumbs up. Every follower of Messianic Judaism, or believer in Jesus Christ as the Savior, should understand the origins of Judaism, what the apostles believed, and what Jews, referred to in the Bible as God's people, continue to believe today. Our video takes you on a captivating journey into the world of Judaism, exploring its diversity and depth. We start by introducing Kabbalah, an ancient doctrine on divine emanations and mystical practices. Then we delve into the various branches of Judaism, from Orthodox to liberal, discussing their impact on Jewish communities worldwide. A significant aspect of our video is examining Messianic Judaism and its connection to Kabbalah. We also discuss survey findings on the preferences of American and European Jews regarding Jewish denominations. Whether you're a follower of a particular denomination or simply curious about Judaism, this video offers you intriguing and informative insights into this great religious tradition. In modern times, it's undeniable that the three main branches of Judaism are fundamentally new phenomena, linked to significantly new models of Jewish existence and consciousness. These arose from a comprehensive modernization of Jewish life, which began in Western Europe around the mid-18th century and in Eastern Europe about a century later. Contemporary Judaism comprises several branches, denominations, or movements ranging from traditionally religious to liberal. However, it's crucial to recognize that Jews are a people, not just a religion. Hence, Jewishness and Judaism are far from being synonymous. While Judaism is considered the religion of the Jewish people, many Jews adopt only those elements of Judaism that resonate with them personally, and some don't practice it at all. There are Jews who have embraced other religions, such as Buddhism. Just half a century ago, Judaism could be described as a religion with three main branches, and most Jews identified with one of them: Orthodox traditional Judaism, Reform liberal, also known as Progressive in Europe Judaism, and Conservative Judaism, a middle ground between the two, but similar to the European Masorti movement. There were also smaller offshoots, like Reconstructionist Judaism, but most Jews align themselves with one of these big three branches. While the big three remain strong, the spectrum of Jewish movements has expanded today. For instance, some identify as Conservadox, a blend of conservative and Orthodox Judaism. The Reform Temple in Brooklyn, which I attended with my family as a child, seems more reformatory, a blend of Reform and Conservative Judaism, though I've never heard that term used than purely Reform. In traditional cooperative society, a Jew's normal economic, social, legal, and religious cultural existence was possible only as part of a tightly knit and distinctly separate Jewish community. The outside world recognized and identified a Jew primarily as a part of their community. If a person ceased to be part of the Jewish community, they were no longer identified as Jewish by either their own people or outsiders. The Jewish community, to the best of its ability, protected its members from a hostile external environment. It guaranteed the stability of their social, legal, and professional status, the continuity of traditional values passed down through generations via a high-quality education system, and even a basic living standard for the poor and marginalized. In exchange, the community demanded one thing: the unconditional acceptance by every Jew of the meticulously regulated norms of behavior, not only in society but also in daily life, and the equally unconditional recognition of the authority of the traditional leadership group. One could say that life within the traditional Jewish community offered very few alternatives. A Jew was typically born and died in the same place as their ancestors, maintained their professional and social status, and taught their children the same things they had learned from their parents. Three aspects of Jewish existence: religious, national, historical, and ethno-cultural, were completely inseparable in their lives and consciousness. If a traditional Jew were asked whether they were Jewish by nationality or religion, they would not understand the question and would ask for clarification. They would need an explanation. Are you Jewish because you believe in God like Jews do, and not like non-Jews? Or are you Jewish because you speak Yiddish, wear traditional Jewish clothing, and live in a Jewish village? Or are you Jewish because your ancestors once lived in Eretz Israel and wrote the Tanakh? But even after such an explanation, the question wouldn't become any clearer. For a traditional Jew, a positive answer to any one of these three questions automatically implied a positive answer to the other two. In the modern era, corporate and estate-based societies were giving way to unitary ones. Each individual interacted with the world on their own, directly, rather than as part of an estate, confession, corporation, or guild. In these conditions, the Jewish community quickly lost its role. The administrative, civil, criminal, and fiscal powers previously delegated to the Jewish community were now fully transferred to the centralized legal state. Belonging to the community ceased to be an important and inevitable component of an individual Jew's life. From now on, they decided for themselves where to live, what profession to pursue, and how to raise their children. Both the gains and losses from each such decision were entirely borne by them and their families. The Jewish community was no longer able to share this responsibility. Traditional community leaders, primarily the rabbis, were generally unprepared for the new situation. The authority of traditional leaders sharply declined, and they were gradually replaced by a new leadership group, those who had achieved material success and prestigious professional status in the larger non-Jewish world: business people, financiers, lawyers, scientists, and artists. Unlike traditional leaders, they did not see themselves as natural bearers and continuers of traditional Jewish values. The greater their success in the outside world, the more they adopted its characteristic value orientation. As the majority of Jews were increasingly caught up in the processes of modernization, they more and more saw these new Jewish leaders as role models. As a result, each Jew in the modern era was presented with a wide range of life choices, the most radical of which, yet still somewhat justifiable, was the rejection of Jewish identity as a principled and consistently implemented decision. Soon, however, it became apparent that the surrounding environment didn't take this rejection of Jewishness seriously. It confidently continued to identify both the defector and their descendants as Jews. But the relevance and drama of such a choice did not diminish from this. Alongside colossal shifts in the sphere of Jewish existence, there were equally significant shifts in the sphere of Jewish consciousness. The intellectual and cognitive horizon of Jews expanded immensely. It encompassed the latest discoveries in Jewish history, Jewish thought, and scientific biblical studies. All this knowledge did not receive and could not receive any adequate interpretation in traditional Jewish consciousness. Therefore, alongside behavioral choices, a cognitive choice became relevant for many Jews: should I think as a Jew or as a modern individual? It should be noted that all these processes were entirely objective and unfolded completely independently of the will of Jews in general, or of any particular trends. Moreover, the emergence of various movements in Judaism was ultimately different attempts to provide Jewish answers to this wide spectrum of choices offered by life itself. The notion of a Jewish answer presupposes from the outset that the preservation of Jewishness in the long historical perspective is perceived as an absolute, ultimate value. The debate was not about whether to be or not to be Jewish or Jewish a question of semantics, but about which Judaism would become the most attractive model in the face of the widest range of alternatives in Jewish existence and consciousness, and thereby prove its historical viability. I believe that despite the obvious polarity between Orthodoxy and Reform, which emerged as separate movements in Germany in the 1820s and 1830s, both emphasized the religious aspect of Jewish existence. National historical and ethnocultural aspects of Judaism were either subdued or reinterpreted as integral parts of Jewish religion. The dispute between Reformists and Orthodox essentially revolved around how broad the boundaries of this religion should be. For Reformists, the ideal scenario was to include all descendants of traditional Jews in Jewish religion. They refused to see Jews as a people united by a common historical fate. The historical connection of the people of Israel with the land of Israel was perceived as a fact of ancient history that once influenced the destiny of the people, but now played no role in its existence. Any forms of orientation towards Eretz Israel were considered anachronistic. For every Jew in the modern era, their homeland was, or at least should be, the country in which they lived. As administrative legal restrictions against Jews were lifted and anti-Semitic prejudices weakened, objective barriers to a German Jew feeling at home in Germany, a French Jew in France, or an Austrian Jew in Austria disappeared. Becoming a full-fledged citizen, a Jew had to become a sincere patriot of the country in which they lived, share its historical fate, and actively participate in civil society. Moreover, they had to do this specifically as representatives of the titular nation, not as members of a national minority. The famous slogan of the Reformists was, "We are Germans of the Mosaic Law, not we are Jewish subjects of the German Empire." No Jewish culture or language was recognized. All of this was declared a consequence of insufficient education and historical alienation from the native nation, i.e., anachronisms that would be overcome with progressive historical development. Thus, the only distinguishing factor from other Germans was a particular Jewish religion. But in that case, this religion, neither in ritual nor in creed, should include anything that would cast doubt on German loyalty. Hence, blessings about the return to the land of Israel and the restoration of the temple, about the gathering of the dispersed, about the restoration of the house of David, were removed from the Shemoneh Esrei prayer. Mention of the chosenness of the Jewish people was removed from all blessings. The very notion of the temple completely changed its meaning in the lexicon of the reformists. For them, any synagogue became a temple just as any church is a temple for Christians. Prayer language was also changed to German, the native language of the Germans of the Mosaic Law. But if religion is indeed the sole factor uniting all Jews, then its boundaries must necessarily be expanded to ensure that no one is left outside. For reformists, the concept of a secular Jew is, in a sense, nonsensical. If you do not believe in our Jewish religion, then what, exactly, constitutes your Jewishness? Such an expansion of confessional boundaries was achieved, alongside the aforementioned de-Palestinization, by completely abandoning the concept of normative halakha and substantially modernizing Jewish theology. The doctrinal content of Judaism was largely reduced to its ethical values, which ultimately were perceived as the Jewish version of a certain religious universal morality shared by all monotheistic religions. Thus, the concept of ethical monotheism emerged. The main theoretician of this new theological approach in the 1830s was the recognized leader of the reformist movement, Rabbi Abraham Geiger. It was he who formulated the two basic postulates of ethical monotheism. Firstly, complete freedom of scientific research based on the principles of historicism. As a result, the problem of cognitive choice was removed. The scientifically critical model of thinking was recognized as truly Jewish. There was no need to choose between scientific truth and religious truth. Only what corresponds to the criteria of scientific truth henceforth has the right of access to religious consciousness. Secondly, Judaism is understood and realized in life as a continuously developing and changing religion and culture. In 1836, Rabbi Geiger formulated his most famous thesis, "I want to prove that all the foundations of present-day Judaism are the product of historical development and therefore cannot have any obligatory force." In other words, no text can be considered God-given in the literal sense of the word. No ceremony, no custom is a direct expression of divine revelation. It should be noted Geiger granted tradition enormous authority, but not divine, purely human. And if so, then all changes in traditions and rituals must have a purely human character. The only criterion of legitimacy of any ritual is its reasonableness. In this approach, one can easily recognize the famous Hegelian thesis, "All that is rational is real." Abraham Geiger, in his theoretical deductions, remained a convinced Hegelian, like practically all German speculative thinkers and philosophers of the time. Thus, Hegelian dialectics helped find a theoretical justification for completely abandoning the concept of normative halakha and replacing it with a set of customs and rituals established and altered by people. However, Geiger did not deny the enormous role played by tradition in Judaism. It was he who introduced the term reform in relation to Judaism, aiming to distinguish gradual and internally justified reform of tradition from arbitrary revolution, from a complete break with Jewish tradition. Such a model of Judaism can be called fluid. Abraham Geiger sought to see Judaism as a living and continuously evolving organism, with roots deeply embedded in the past while sprouting new shoots into the future. In this methodological premise, Geiger introduces his central theological category, the notion of the Jewish spirit, or Jewish genius. The Jewish genius encompasses religious moral principles that are created and renewed in each generation of the Jewish people, based on traditional cultural continuity. It represents the inexhaustible Jewish potential of ideas, creativity, and faith. Only a bearer of the Jewish genius can adequately grasp the phenomenon of Jewish history. Thus, in the teachings of Geiger, the concept of ethical monotheism also receives profound theological justification. Are you still with me? If you're interested in exploring contemporary forms of Judaism, hit the like button. In response to the reformist desire to broaden the boundaries of Jewish religion to include practically everyone who identifies as Jewish, the Orthodox proposed much stricter, truly Orthodox parameters of Jewish religion. Jews were generally perceived as a religious community. What was required of those who claimed to be religious Jews? Firstly, strict observance of halakha. However, even in this, orthodoxy cannot claim to be the legitimate heir of traditional Judaism. In traditional Jewish communities, the role of the posek in halakha has always been significant, but so has been his responsibility. Before issuing any ruling, he, along with its strictly halakhic aspects, always carefully weighed how applicable it would be to the real life and daily existence of Jews. The principle of not imposing obligations beyond what people can bear was never overlooked by the rabbi jurists for a moment when making decisions. At the same time, the posek, when issuing a ruling, always relied on the entire corpus of halakhic sources, primarily the Gemara, then the Rishonim, and only then on later halakhic codes such as the Rif, Rambam, Arbiturim, Sefer Mitzvot Gadalat, Sefer Mitzvot Kadanat, Sefer Hachinuk, Sefer Mordechai, and so forth. Finally, each posek issued a targeted ruling. It was addressed to the community in which he held the position of posek or dayan. Orthodox Judaism, to one degree or another, departed from all of these rules. Paradoxically, the emergence of new media, particularly printing, played a significant role in this. The Shulchan Aruch became the first comprehensive halakhic code to be printed in mass circulation and distributed among Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities in Europe and the Middle East. As a result, the appearance of similar comprehensive codes later became impossible. Starting from the 18th century, practically all poseks recognized its absolute authority. From then on, any halakhic ruling, although still referencing the Gemara and Rishonim, was effectively oriented toward the Shulchan Aruch, whose opinion was cited last and invariably accepted as unquestionably authoritative, even if it clearly contradicted earlier sources. Such contradictions in the Shulchan Aruch occur because Rabbi Joseph Caro sometimes decided halakha based essentially on esoteric Kabbalistic traditions rather than on the codes of the Rif, Rambam, and Rosh, as he declared. At that time, halakhic rulings lost their targetedness. Henceforth, every prominent posek could disseminate his rulings in mass circulation and initially address them to the world and the city, but, most importantly, the halakhic rulings of the modern era were not intended for practical application by the entire Jewish community, but only for those who were initially religious and were willing, without hesitation, to follow these rulings despite all practical difficulties. A characteristic example of this approach can be seen in the famous halakhic ruling on the second day of Jewish holidays, issued in Mantua in 1854. A large group of craftsmen and merchants appealed to Rabbi Israel Moshe Hazan, the chief rabbi of Rome and the foremost halakhic authority of the time, with a request to abolish or mitigate the halakhic prohibitions of the second day of festivals. They explained their request by stating that these prohibitions were not being observed anyway, as the extended hiatus from work and trade, amidst fierce competition with Christian merchants, caused significant financial damage to Jewish traders. Rabbi Moshe Hazan began his response by emphasizing the need to be lenient towards such violations, as they were not driven by a fundamental unwillingness to observe halakha, but rather by the frailty of human nature. However, he categorically refused to amend the halakha, although he acknowledged that the second day was not a biblical commandment, but merely an ancient custom. If they cannot endure the financial loss, then it is better for them to desecrate the second day of the festival, acknowledging it as a transgression but not demanding its abolition. Abolishing the second day is infinitely more serious than its desecration. We see that the halakhic ruling is issued with a clear understanding that it will not be observed even by those to whom it is directly addressed, let alone by the entire Jewish community. In traditional Judaism, each new halakhic ruling had meaning and value precisely as practical regulation of Jewish behavior. In this case, the posek establishes a norm that is clearly unattainable, obviously not based on Torah law, in order to reaffirm his exclusive prerogative to interpret halakha and to eradicate the very idea of possible leniencies and adjustments prompted by new socioeconomic realities. Halakha is not a behavioral norm, but rather a kind of gold standard kept under wraps in a vacuum, so that all Jews can look at it and understand how far they are from the correct Jewish way of life. This approach is also related to the second characteristic of Orthodox Judaism, its attitude towards non-observant Jews. Overall, it resembles the famous saying of a French abbot, who, when an elderly peasant woman confessed that she desperately wanted to eat meat during Lent, replied without hesitation, "Eat meat and remain Catholic. Trade on the second day of the festival, but with an awareness of your sin, not because halakha permits trading." Even if you step into a synagogue only 4 times in your life for a circumcision, a bar mitzvah, a wedding, and to say Kaddish for parents, it should be the right one, i.e., an Orthodox synagogue, and the rest of the time, you should firmly remember that you do not attend an Orthodox synagogue, not somewhere else. As long as you are willing to acknowledge that there is only one, Orthodox Judaism, that there is an eternal and unchanging halakha with a capital letter, any violations you commit can be categorized as stolen children, i.e., not understanding the seriousness of the violation or a violator succumbing to passion. The secular, i.e., non-observant Jews, more or less fit into the new model of Israel proposed by the Orthodox. In any nation, there are believers and non-believers, but both should respect their religion: the French Catholic, Germans Protestant, Russians Orthodox. A secular person is not obliged to be interested in rituals and dogmas of faith. The only thing they must know is precisely where geographically and ideologically their national synagogue is. Similarly, secular Jews should relate to their Jewish religion, with the role of priests being fulfilled by rabbis. As long as this external respect is observed, the secular person is not a problem. However, if a secular person insists on independently judging religious truths, especially rituals, they transform from a lost sheep into an ideological enemy with whom no compromise is possible. The secular part of the Jewish people is conceived as a kind of periphery of the Jewish nation, united with its main and central part, i.e., religious Jews, by common origin, shared historical destiny, and recognition of their unquestionable authority in all matters concerning Jewish tradition. It is only in this sense that the concept of Klal Yisrael, the people of Israel, exists for Orthodoxy, not as a living and developing ethnocultural organism. Its secular part is, in a way, the reserve of the Jewish people, from which, if necessary, fresh recruits can be drawn. The phenomenon of returning to religion has always been seen by Orthodoxy as a justification and explanation for the existence of secular Jews. In modern Israel, the necessity of coexisting within the framework of a unified society and state has been added to these factors of unity. It is said that in Bnei Brak there was a sign that hung for a long-time driver: respect the religious feelings of the believers. On Saturdays and holidays, take a different road. Obviously, halakhically, the degree of violation will not change, no matter which road the driver takes. But if he allows himself to turn a blind eye to his violation, then by doing so, he acknowledges that in principle, halakhic norms are obligatory and implicitly recognizes himself as a violator, agreeing to play by the rules formulated in the Mantuan ruling of 1854 regarding the second day of the festival. This approach has little in common with traditional Judaism. When the first Epikuros who did not observe Shabbat appeared in a Polish town at the end of the 19th century, the local rabbi, upon meeting him on the street, burst into tears and said, "Son, what are you doing? Today is Shabbos." In traditional Judaism, the non-observance of Shabbat by any Jew, without exception, was perceived as a problem as acute and personal as today's non-observance of Shabbat by children in religious families. Orthodoxy, on the contrary, legitimizes such spontaneous non-observance, provided it does not claim an independent ideological status. From this inevitably follows the total rejection of any alternative versions of Judaism. Such movements declare the possibility of different behavioral and cognitive models, while insisting that they should all be equally recognized as Jewish. Plurality, by definition, is incompatible with orthodoxy because it excludes the presence of a unified religious authority, empowered to proclaim eternal and unchanging truths of Jewish religion, Judaism as such. Orthodoxy vigorously asserts its claim to the role of such a center, not only in the sphere of halakha, but also in the sphere of religious, moral, political, and social values, thus fully justifying the name given to this movement in the early 19th century by non-Jews, by analogy with similar phenomena in the history of the Christian Church. This, too, is an undeniable innovation compared to traditional Judaism. In the Gemara, and indeed in the Oral Torah as a whole, questions of worldview have always occupied a rather modest place. Pirkei Avot is precisely the exception that proves the rule. Jewish law, especially civil, but also matrimonial, family, social institutions, and everyday life have always responded quite flexibly to changes in the realities of the surrounding world. For example, the famous streimels and capotes were borrowed from German and Dutch burghers no later than the end of the 17th century. By the way, this little ethnographic detail allows us to unmistakably understand when traditional Judaism began to transform into orthodoxy. Until the 17th century, differences in attire were not considered by anyone as a significant element of Jewish behavior. The situation is more complex in the sphere of doctrinal or dogmatic matters. The 13 principles of faith of Maimonides are well known to all. This was the first attempt of its kind to bring together the principles of correct Jewish faith orthodoxy in Greek, Pravoslavy, and Old Slavic. This attempt, undoubtedly influenced by similar creeds among Muslims and Christians, was not immediately accepted by everyone, but it can be said that by the end of the Middle Ages, Maimonides' 13 principles had acquired their undisputed status in the Jewish world. In this sense, Maimonides can be considered a precursor of the Orthodox approach. He emphasized that these principles were intended for the common people who should not delve into philosophical wisdom. For himself, and for those who had mastered this wisdom, the great thinker reserved the right to a much deeper and non-dogmatic view of religious problems, as demonstrated in the Guide for the Perplexed. The idea of a mandatory minimum of religious belief was necessary for him in polemics against his opponents. However, it is precisely on this idea of a mandatory minimum of dogmas that today, essentially, all Orthodox theology is built. Since demanding even a minimum observance from modern Jews is already impossible, it is this requirement of a minimum of faith that comes to the fore in relations with those who seek to comprehend the higher meaning of their Jewish existence in fundamentally new social and political conditions created by the revival of the national Jewish state. Such a view of Judaism as a religion whose affiliation is conditioned by the recognition of a number of dogmas of faith is very popular today among repatriates from the former USSR. The traditional dichotomy of believers and non-believers, rooted in basic models of Christian worldview, is fully transferred to Jewish consciousness. Like the abbot who persuaded his parishioner that one could be a good Catholic and eat meat during Lent, some well-known religious thinkers today persuade their compatriots from the former USSR that one can be a secular believer. It would be more accurate to say a secular Orthodox. On the one hand, this approach resolves all behavioral and psychological problems associated with the inability and unwillingness to adhere to traditional halakhic observance. However, on the other hand, it requires zealous control over the sphere of purely ideological matters, which was not characteristic of traditional Judaism. Traditional Jews, as mentioned earlier, generally did not compartmentalize their Jewish existence, viewing it as part of a unique community with its own language, way of life, social and professional behavior, and religious consciousness. For modern secular Orthodox individuals, the acute deficit of Jewish parameters of existence and Jewish behavioral models is compensated by an excess of Jewish religiosity. They willingly accept the role of a sort of periphery within the strictly centralized Jewish world offered by Orthodoxy and feel quite comfortable on this periphery. Regarding Eretz Israel, the return of the dispersed and the restoration of the Jewish state, the Orthodoxy of the 19th century initially held a dual position. All these values nominally remained part of dogma and liturgy, but their practical implementation was deferred to Messianic times, from the dimension of historical to meta-historical. Under the influence of the undeniable successes of Zionism, the attitude of a significant portion of the Orthodox towards these ideas began to change, but this was already a correction of ideology under politics rather than the primary formative set of Orthodox values. Interestingly, similar shifts occurred in the 20th century in Reform Judaism, where sharp disagreements also emerged between Zionist and anti-Zionist circles. Alongside purely religious movements, the modern era gave rise to many fundamentally new forms of Jewish consciousness, which, in the broadest terms, can be characterized as Jewish cultural nationalism. For these ideologies, the main parameters of Jewish existence in the historically long term became ethnic, linguistic, and cultural components. Despite complete or nearly complete indifference to religious questions, these currents and teachings actively contributed to the development of literature and theater in Yiddish, Jewish schools, including vocational technical ones, and Jewish visual arts. In the context of our discussion of the three currents, it is worth mentioning these phenomena, at least briefly. If Reform Judaism and, to some extent, Orthodoxy represent the idea of Jewish religion, stripped of its ethno-cultural and national historical parameters of Jewish consciousness and Jewish existence, then Jewish cultural nationalism and, to some extent, autonomism represent the idea of the Jewish nation, sterile in religious and historical terms. The most recent, clearly caricatured, and hopefully last manifestation of such ideology is the popular idea today among our former compatriots in Germany that the historical homeland of Ashkenazi Jews should be recognized as Germany. In substantiating their claims, they reference Yiddish, German surnames, migration routes, and the like. While this may seem like a caricature, there is a certain ideological continuity concerning both the culturalists and the autonomists. They both tend to forget the origins of the Israeli people. There isn't enough time to delve into Zionism in detail, but it initially focused on the historical aspect of Jewish existence. In its classical Herzlian version, it was largely indifferent to religious and cultural questions. Both of these aspects were later incorporated, not based on a consensus of general Zionism, but rather as ideological offshoots of the primary Zionist idea. So, let's move on to the concluding part of our discussion. Against the backdrop outlined above, the main characteristic of conservative Judaism becomes clear. This movement, from its inception, recognized the necessity of considering the religious, ethno-cultural, and national historical parameters of Jewish existence as an integrated whole. The eminent Jewish historian of the 19th century, Hermann Graetz, along with Zacharias Frankel, can be considered pioneers of a new ideological direction, the historico-critical school in Germany. Graetz always insisted that the Torah of Israel, the people of Israel, and the land of Israel can only be understood in their inseparable unity. This idea was further developed in the works of Solomon Schechter, who essentially established conservative Judaism as a distinct ideological and organizational movement in the late 19th century. It distinguished itself from both the Reformists and the Orthodox. The central theological category for Solomon Schechter was Klal Yisrael, the community of Israel. This community exists not only as the sum of all contemporary Jews, but as something greater is the sum of all generations of Israel, a bridge in time stretching from the ancient past to the distant future. Regarding the eternity of Israel, Schechter wrote, Israel never apologized for its existence. It believed that the separateness of Israel, which constitutes a unity in both national and religious aspects, is an undisputed historical fact, and there is nothing to apologize for. Israel has the right to look far back at its great achievements and to nurture hopes for its glorious future, to live its own life, think its own thoughts, and zealously guard its uniqueness, both national and religious, through symbols, ceremonies, and its sacred language. From this excerpt, it is clear that the very idea of dividing national Israel and religious Judaism is entirely foreign to Solomon Schechter. But even more importantly, this ideal synthesis of the national and the religious, not achieved by any historical nation or civilization, can only be understood and experienced as a historical projection of the deepest meta-historical unity between the people of Israel and the God of Israel. Israel is as eternal as it is universal. It is the rock upon which the universe is built. Like a rock rising amidst the sea, the Knesset of Israel stands above history, reflecting all assaults and temptations, for the great waters cannot quench love between God and the Knesset of Israel. However, this unyielding rock faces new threats today. Galut inevitably carries the risk of assimilation and the gradual loss of those invaluable spiritual values that our ancestors preserved and transmitted for millennia. The complete and harmonious union of the Almighty and the chosen people is only possible when a third ingredient, the land of Israel, becomes part of its existence. This is how Schechter himself writes about it: the rebirth of Israel's national consciousness and the revival of Israel's religion, or in short, the revival of Judaism, are inseparable. When Israel finds itself, it finds its God. When Israel loses itself or begins to act self-destructively, it surely loses its God. The chosenness of Israel, the inviolability of the divine covenant with Israel, the immortality of Israel as a nation, and the ultimate revival of Israel in Palestine, where the people will live a holy life on the holy land, with all the far-reaching consequences for transforming humanity and establishing the kingdom of God on earth, are indivisible in the Jewish soul. These are the common ideals and shared ideas that permeate all Jewish literature over 4,000 years, including much of its Hellenistic corpus. This quote is extremely important because it answers the most complex question that inevitably arises today for any ideological direction of Judaism, and indeed for any Jew. It concerns the relationship between the particular and the universal in Jewish consciousness and Jewish existence. All disagreements and disputes that have shaken the Jewish people for millennia, making the achievement of the desired unity impossible for much of its historical existence, were largely disputes over this question. It is no coincidence that Schechter separately mentions the place of Hellenistic literature in Jewish thought. It was Hellenistic Judaism that most clearly and consistently expressed, at its time, the universalist tendency, while contemporary Judaism of the Mishnah and Talmud in the land of Israel was increasingly closing itself off in particularism. The translation of the Torah into Greek became the highest and deeply symbolic manifestation of Hellenistic universalism, not only altering the spiritual landscape of Western civilization, but also tragically indicating the place of the people of Israel within this civilization. From the above, it is quite clear what the choice was between the two competing trends of Judaism in 19th century Germany. The reformists confidently advocated for the universal values of Judaism, placing it alongside other monotheistic religions, and sacrificed everything they saw as a manifestation of Jewish particularism. On the contrary, the Orthodox saw the main purpose of their religious dogma and the main goal of their restrictive halakhic practices precisely in isolating Israel from all other nations with an invisible wall, which, in principle, should replace the disappeared walls of the ghetto. They sought to eradicate the idea of racial unity among Jews and all of humanity from Jewish consciousness, and to make contacts with neighbors and their inevitable result assimilation impossible in Jewish existence. Well aware of the threat that assimilation poses to the Jewish people, Schechter understood that the genuine solution to this problem is only possible through the path of the people's return to the land of Israel. Only there will Israel find the full measure of its universality and will ultimately be able to influence the transformation of all humanity. But only there will Israel also find the full measure of its particularity, becoming a truly distinct and independent people. And this epochal transformation will affect the entire nation, all Jews without exception. Only in the land of Israel will the concept of Kol Yisrael, the community of Israel, be filled with concrete socio-political and spiritual religious content. Zionism openly declares to the world that Judaism seeks to preserve its life, not to lose it. This must be a true and healthy life, with its own politics and, to the fullest extent, with its own religion. It is understandable that only a sovereign people can have its own policy. But why is it possible for its own, fully fledged religion to exist only in the land of Israel? Here we return to the central question to which all three movements in Judaism, in one way or another, claim to provide an answer: what should be the relationship between tradition and innovation? What are the goals and paths of renewing tradition? And who and how is authorized to renew it? For Schechter, it is evident that in this matter, the decisive role belongs to the community of Israel. Only it is the highest authority that has the final say. This living organism cannot be represented by any particular part of the people, nor by any collective spiritual shepherd, nor by a collective rabbinate, but only by the community of Israel embodied in the universal synagogue. But in reality, such a community and such a universal synagogue can function and influence the fate of the people only by reuniting as a social organism and by feeling, with clarity, the commonality of their historical destiny. It is in this sense that only in the land of Israel does the religion of Israel attain the full measure of its uniqueness, ceasing to be a voluntary or involuntary imitation and replica of the religions of other nations. Today, we are infinitely closer to this state than in the time of Solomon Schechter, but even today, the community of Israel, as a unified whole, remains an ideal for us, towards which we continue to strive. Another important question is the attitude towards scientific biblical studies, the possibility and permissibility of free scientific research in Judaism. For example, the authorship of 2nd Isaiah is a fact, no less factual than the skepticism of Kohelet, and David is not the author of all the Psalms. The question is now posed not as in the old school, i.e., not about whether the tradition is wrong in one aspect or another, but about whether it contains elements of truth at all. For example, does Moses, if such a person ever existed at all, have any relation to the collection of books known as the Torah of Moses? The existence of King David is not currently being disputed. The question is whether he wrote, or given the particular religious situation of that time, could he, or at least his contemporaries, or their successors over the next 4 centuries, write even one hymn from that collection traditionally attributed to him? The answers given by the modern school to these questions are mostly negative. But it is highly doubtful whether the reconstruction of Israeli history, as well as new hypotheses about the authorship of documents included in the Tanakh, can achieve the level of reliability that would allow a teacher to convey these conclusions to the audience without any reservations. Schechter understood that it is impossible, in an open, free atmosphere of scientific inquiry, to draw a definitive line where critical reason falls silent and bows to the authority of tradition. But he also saw the flip side of the coin just as clearly. Any scientific conclusion, especially in textual analysis, is sufficiently conditional tomorrow. This conclusion may be refuted by a new reading of the same text, by new linguistic and systemic analysis methodologies. As long as it's just a game of beads within a circle of the initiated, it's not a significant problem. But if one of these initiated enters the audience, clothed with the authority of a rabbi and a teacher, They must each time solve the most complex questions, not only of a didactic, but also of a spiritual and moral nature. There are no ready-made answers to these questions. The place, time, and general atmosphere in the audience greatly influence these answers. But the teacher is obliged to ask such questions. In this sense, he radically differs from a physics or mathematics teacher. And another question, to which Schechter was also prepared to give a clear answer, unlike many of his colleagues and followers, is the question of articles of faith. Some dogmas inherent to Judaism, such as the existence of God, providence, reward, and punishment, without which it is impossible to conceive any religion of revelation, can hardly be called a credo in the modern understanding of that word, which implies something external and alien to one's own reason, accepted only under the influence of external authority. Indeed, these ideas arise in the soul of every person as soon as they begin to ponder the meaning of life, the reasons for evil and suffering in the world, as soon as the universe ceases to be a chaos of randomness for them and acquires an intelligible order akin to that of the cosmos. People express these ideas in various conceptual, philosophical, and confessional languages. But only those who have never looked up at the starry sky and reflected on the nature of human morality, and there are quite a few of them, can confidently say that these ideas are completely alien to them. In this sense, the enumerated foundations are part of our life, our self-awareness, and our introspection. And of course, when speaking about modern Judaism, it's necessary to mention Hasidism, a subsect of ultra-Orthodox Judaism. Its followers are called Hasidim. Hasidism is divided into many dynastic communities named after the European cities from which they originated. For example, the Lubavitcher Hasidim, who hail from the city of Lubavitch near modern-day Belarus. Each dynasty is led by its own Rebbe, a person whom followers consider a special spiritual authority and guide to God, and often turn to for blessings and advice. The second characteristic of this movement is that Hasidic teaching includes Kabbalah, often referred to as Jewish mysticism. According to the variety of Kabbalah followed by Hasidism known as Lurianic Kabbalah, named after its founder Isaac Luria, God is immanent, meaning he is present in all of his creation throughout the entire universe. In the Kabbalistic perspective, God exists within 10 spheres or emanations and contracted within himself to create the universe. At that moment, divine sparks were encased in vessels which subsequently shattered, scattering sparks throughout creation and bringing evil into the world. Now, as Kabbalists assert, we must find and return these sparks by fulfilling mitzvot, or commandments. From the concept of God's immanence also arises the idea that we should worship him with joy, often expressed through dance and song, and find spirituality in everyday actions. According to a 2013 survey in the USA, only 10% of American Jews identified themselves as Orthodox. In contrast, in Europe, this group remains the most numerous. In turn, Messianic Jews unequivocally tell the Jewish world that they believe that Yeshua is the Messiah of Israel. They believe that Yeshua fulfills the Torah rather than abolishes it. Therefore, in the light of his teaching, they observe the Torah. They believe that due to God's covenant with Israel, there is much beauty in Jewish tradition, so they do not consider it contradictory to their faith in Yeshua. They honor these traditions. Regarding Kabbalah and its connection with Messianic Judaism, we will discuss it in our upcoming videos, so subscribe to our channel not to miss our future content. Regardless of the number of followers, each branch of Judaism both reflects and shapes the thinking and behavior of the Jewish people worldwide. Each of them has its place in the wide spectrum from ultra-Orthodox to ultra-liberal. This spectrum includes approximately 30% of Jews who do not belong to any branch of Judaism, while still considering themselves Jews. Although Judaism demonstrates crucial unity, it never ceases to showcase remarkable diversity to the world. In conclusion, our video highlights the rich tapestry of Judaism, showcasing its diverse beliefs, practices, and communities. From the mystical teachings of Kabbalah to the varied denominations spanning Orthodox to liberal, Judaism encompasses a spectrum of traditions and interpretations. We've explored the unique perspective of Messianic Jews, who blend traditional Jewish practices with the belief in Jesus as the Messiah, shedding light on the complexity within Jewish identity. Despite these differences, Judaism remains united by a shared heritage and values, exemplifying both unity and diversity within its global community. Whether Orthodox, Reform, or somewhere in between, each branch contributes to the vibrant mosaic of Jewish life, underscoring the resilience and adaptability of this ancient faith. If you found this exploration of Messianic Judaism insightful and engaging, don't miss out on our upcoming videos. Subscribe to our channel to stay updated and continue delving into fascinating discussions about religion, culture, and more. Join our community and be part of the conversation.